Hello and welcome to Aspects of Writing. I'm your host, James Kelly, and my guest panelist for today is Janet Coursey. Our guests for the show are Morgan St. James and Phyllice Bradner. The topic of our show is writing with a sibling. But before we get to my guests, my panel and I would like to read a few fun quips or quotes about writing. And Jan, I'm going to let you start.
This first one is absolutely correct. Fiction is about stuff that's screwed up. Nancy Kress.
Well, my quote is kind of fun, too. It's, if you write one story, it may be bad. If you write 100, you have the odds in your favor. And that was Edgar Rice Burroughs who said that.
Well, Somerset Maugham said, all the words I use in my stories can be found in the dictionary. It's just a matter of arranging them into the right sentences. I think that's pretty right.
That is absolutely right. And mine is by Truman Capote. It says, finishing a book is like you took a child out in the backyard and shot it. I don't know why he said that.
I could not get that one.
I know.
No. And he's a crime writer, so.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, if you're just tuning in, you're listening to Aspects of Writing with me, your host, James Kelly, and my guest panelist is Janet Coursey. Our guests for the show today are Morgan St. James, who's also one of our panelists, and Phyllice Bradner. The topic of the show is writing with a sibling, and wonder why that is.
Yeah.
Okay, and Jan, she's also the author of The Secrets of Time, and she's been a part of the show for at least 4 years, maybe five. Five, yeah.
Yeah.
And so what are you working on now, Jan, after The Secrets of Time?
The Secrets of Time, Treasures of the Heart. And it's with an editor right now, and hopefully by January, February, it'll be on the market.
All right. And I'm going to let you
Great.
introduce our Morgan.
I was explaining to the girls I am in absolute heaven with the two of them here. They are so talented. And as a former interior designer, Morgan spent many years designing interiors for model homes, celebrities, restaurants, and offices. Her writing career was launched with Designers West magazine, approached her during the time she owned an interior design studio in California and was asked to write an article about the industry. The article was so well received, Morgan wrote many more how-to articles for designers. From there, her topics expanded to diverse subjects, including mysteries, romance, murder, and more. Morgan St. James lives here in Las Vegas with her dog, Dylan, who is recovering from surgery. I'm so glad he's doing so much better. Morgan is on the board of Writers of Southern Nevada and belongs to multiple writers groups. Morgan started the Writers Tricks of the Trade newsletter, which has grown into a quarterly Writers Tricks of the Trade e-zine with articles contributed by writers and people in the publishing business from all over the United States and occasionally from as far away as Europe. She has written over 600 published articles about the business and craft of writing. And Morgan, what else can you tell us about you other than we know you're magnificent?
Well, you know my stock answer, Janet. How many hours have you got?
All the time it takes.
But I will add that I currently have 16 books in publication, and just last night, Phyllis and I started the plotting for number 17, the 5th book in the Silver Sisters Mystery Series.
I'm excited.
Yeah, and I'm not going to take up, like 2 or 3 hours with all the other stuff about me, because I know eventually we have to move on.
Yes.
So I'm going to turn it over to James
All
to tell us
right.
about my dear sister, Phyllis.
Okay. Our next guest is Phyllice Bradner, and that's Morgan's sister. Phyllis is a well-known artist and designer. Phyllis moved to Oregon in 2005 from Alaska, where she lived for almost 40 years.
Wow.
She grew up in Los Angeles and worked for an advertising art studio after college. She was the art director of 2 advertising agencies in Anchorage, ran her own communication consulting business for 17 years, was the publication specialist for Alaska Division of Tourism for 7 years, later produced television commercials at ABC TV in Juneau. Upon arriving in McMinnville, Oregon, she was instrumental in forming the artist-owned Currents Gallery. And you still have that, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Phyllis has also owned an antique shop, worked as an interior designer, acted as a political consultant, and is best known in Alaska for her architectural design work, which includes designing and coordinating the restoration of the Governor's Mansion, portions of the Capitol Building, and the Senate Building. She is co-author of the award-winning Silver Sisters mystery books with her sister Morgan St. James. Phyllis is accomplished in several different medias. She experiments with various types of printmaking, paints in acrylics and oils, paints on silks. On silk. As a weaver, her work has won awards in 2 Alaska statewide juried art shows. Okay, Phyllis, what else do I need to know about you?
Wow. I can't sing or dance.
I don't believe you.
You know, God gives everybody something, and music is something I can't do. So there's one thing. I don't know, I can't recall with that long litany whether you also said that I was a political print consultant.
No.
I did the print matter for 27 statewide campaigns over the course of my 40 years in Alaska. Several of them were governor's races and U.S. Senate races and so forth. So that's, you know, kind of an interesting thing. Right now I am more into art than the writing, and I am the co-owner of Currents Gallery, as you mentioned, which has now been open for 13 years. Which is the length of time I've been in Oregon.
Marvelous.
Yeah, and it's a successful little gallery in the heart of wine country in Oregon. And the writing aspect of my life is done pretty much exclusively working on the Silver Sisters mysteries with Morgan, and then the rest of my time is spent producing art.
Yeah.
Yeah, as you can tell, both Phyllis and I have very narrow focuses in the things that we've done.
Yeah. We haven't formed a girl band.
That's next.
No.
Later this afternoon.
Well, I'm going to go into a series of questions about writing together, and we've done shows on collaboration, and really that's what you're doing. It's just has to be a little bit different as 2 sisters, but we'll talk about that. So the first thing I want to ask you is what are a few famous siblings that we know have written together? And I thought of Dear Abby and Ann Landers,
Yes.
even though they didn't really write together, I guess.
No, they didn't.
They wrote separate columns.
Yeah, but they wrote the same type of thing.
As
Yeah.
I recall the story, they were actually at odds with each other.
Right.
Yeah,
They-
yeah,
Oh,
that's
really?
right.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. They
Yeah.
were very competitive.
Yeah.
And I tried to find on the internet, there was one family, I think the Barrett's family from the 1800s. There were like 4 of them that wrote together, 3 sisters and a brother. And they kind of wrote collaboratively.
Yeah,
But-
and you know, I think about again, not siblings but related. Mary Higgins Clark and Carol Higgins, and I believe Carol Higgins is her daughter or her daughter-in-law. I'm not sure, and I think they have actually collaborated on a couple of books, and then they both write on their own. And the other ones that I think about are the Kellermans. You know, Faith Kellerman and Jonathan Kellerman, and now the 2 children are also writing books.
Oh.
And again, I don't know if they've collaborated together on books, but each of the Kellermans have published writing credits, and quite a few of them.
Yeah.
I suspect that Morgan and I get along quite well, but I suspect that you don't find a lot of sibling working together because they probably argue too much.
Yeah, and I could not find, like I said, I couldn't find one, example like the 2 of you write the Silver Sisters series.
Yeah, there was a team of sisters, and I knew all about them, and senior moment, I can't remember who they were.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of families out there that like A. Milne,
Right.
his niece was on our show. She writes as well. So there, and then her uncle was also a travel writer. So there are families that have siblings that
Right.
have written, but I haven't found any that really work together. So this is why it's going to be kind of a neat show to talk about this and encourage anyone out there who has a brother or sister or a mom and dad trying to
Yeah.
write together.
You know how we settle things?
You choke each other to death.
Actually, we decided very early on that we were not going to argue, heavily about something. We weren't going to insult each other, and whoever felt the strongest about the thing in question, they won. That's it. If we were arguing about the place or the name or whatever, it was whoever just sort of said, no, it must be like this. Okay, you win.
Yeah, and give some qualification as to why
Right.
you feel that way.
Right.
Yeah.
And in fact, we had that little session last night
That's
where,
right.
you know, we were plotting the latest book, and we both had similar ideas and some different ideas. And then it comes down to the discussion of, well, why do you feel like that? And, well, yeah, I disagree, but wait a minute, what you've explained now, I don't disagree so much,
Yeah.
or absolutely not.
Yeah, and really just boils down to whoever is the most adamant about it.
Right.
Just plain wins and we move on.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, yeah, as long as your characters move forward
Yes.
and you get to where you need to be,
Right.
sometimes that argument really isn't there. It's just
Well, I'm sure it helped that you were in Alaska when this all started and you were in Los Angeles.
Right.
Well, it's a very
And we didn't have email.
yes.
We used to do our things by fax or telephone.
That's right.
And we didn't
Wow.
have unlimited long distance, so some of our calls would really be expensive.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
But an interesting thing is that Morgan and I are several years apart in age, and we really never were quote unquote friends
Her mic came
Right.
down there.
as we were growing up.
Push the mic.
We, we had different kinds of
There we go. The plug.
kinds of friends. I was in Alaska for 40 years. Morgan was in LA. So, we liked each other, surely, but we just really didn't do much together. And then when we started writing the books, we suddenly became best friends. And through all the years that we've been working together, we've just become inseparable. And you would have never guessed that if you saw us like in our 30s or something.
Yeah, well, the thing was, when we were younger, Phyllis was the pest. and Phyllis tells me I was the tyrant.
Yeah.
And, it would be like Phyllis was maybe 9 years old, and my mom would say, well, take Phyllis along with you with your girlfriends, and things like that. And right about the time that we really would have become friends and related to each other, when Phyllis was 20, I believe,
21.
and I was like 25, and that's when she moved to Alaska. And so we never really got a good chance to connect as adults.
What took you to Alaska?
I was married to a young man who was in the military during the Vietnam.
So you went to Anchorage?
He got the draft notice in the mail and immediately didn't open it. Immediately ran down to the recruitment center and said, "If I sign up, where will you send me?" Because he assumed that if he went ahead and got drafted, he'd be sent to Vietnam.
Right.
So they said, "Well, you got three choices. You could go to Hawaii, you could go to Germany, or you could go to Alaska." And he said, "I'll take it."
yeah.
And then he said, he figured that since they had such an attitude about Alaska, that he could probably stay there for the full 3 years he was enlisted, and he did. And I became established in Alaska at that time, and he went back to Los Angeles at the end of his run because he was, it was a different. We had grown apart.
Oh, okay. And you stayed?
I stayed.
Yeah.
By that time, I was already working for a large advertising agency in Alaska, and it was the atmosphere that in the '60s in Alaska that if you could do something, you got the job. Like in LA, if I wanted to apply for an art assistant job or whatever, there were 500 people in front of me, and they were all better than me.
Yeah.
In Anchorage, there were 3 people applying for the job, and if you looked better than the other 2, you got it.
Yeah.
So I found that there was just a wonderful, opening for blossoming and moving ahead in Alaska, and I just wasn't interested in going back to California.
And people don't realize how beautiful it is there.
Oh, yeah,
it is.
It really is nice.
I could fill your whole hour with information about Alaska
Yeah.
and all of that, but I know we want to move on. But that's how I.
You know
got
what
there.
I didn't ask you, and I really need you to talk a little bit about it, is the Silver Sisters mystery series that you've been writing. What are those books about?
Us.
No, actually, Phyllis had come down to Los Angeles because my mom was, she had some mini stroke. Oh, no, that was when she had a thyroid operation.
Right.
And so Phyllis was staying with me, and we were talking and talking. Number one, we started to find out that we liked each other.
Yeah.
Number
Surprise.
Yeah.
Finally. And number 2, we found out that we both liked funny mysteries. And number 3, we were both published writers, but neither of us had written fiction.
So
And
she's
so-
Phyllis published separately from you?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Phyllis has a lot of publication to her credit also.
Okay.
And I had written a touring book for Juno. I had written a cookbook with some friends of mine in Juno. I was a copywriter as well as a graphic designer, so I wrote copy for like annual reports and informational materials and that kind of thing.
So you went from Anchorage then to Juneau.
That's correct.
Okay.
I served my time in Anchorage for 12 years, and then I lived for 28 years in Juneau.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah, so after she went back to Alaska, I got hold of Phyllis and I said, you know what would you think of this idea? We both love funny mysteries. What about creating our own mystery series? And she said, well, I don't know. What would we do? And I said, well, let's see. We could have a couple of sisters. And Phyllis goes, twins. I go, okay, that's good. And I said, one could live in Alaska, and she could be kind of an over-the-hill flower child. And Phyllis goes, me?
Yeah,
She made you
I
over
said,
the hill?
"Oh," and I had owned an antique store in Juneau, and she could own an antique store, and the other one could live in Beverly Hills, and she could be a socialite, and my sister has always been the fashionista,
and she lived in outside Beverly
She
Hills.
wasn't rich like our character, but she wasn't nearly as selfish as our character, but she had aspects of her personality that could be translated into the Beverly Hills socialite, and I was the aging hippie that had an antique store in Alaska. What can I say?
Yeah, and I
Well,
I
they say
think
write what we know.
Right. I think a good
That's
way
exactly
to
it.
describe the difference in the personalities is if, let's assume there was a homeless person, and Phyllis would say, here's the shirt off my back. Can I take you to Goodwill and buy you a coat? And so that would be Goldie. Godiva would say, the shirt is enough.
Or that was too much.
Sounds an awful lot like my sister Linda and me. Yeah.
We kind of describe ourselves as the difference between Goodwill and Gucci.
Okay.
Oh.
So how many books have you written in that series?
We have 4 that are in publication now: A Corpse in the Soup, Terror in a Teapot, Vanishing Act in Vegas, and Diamonds in the Dumpster. And the one that we're just starting on has the working title of Bones in the Belfry, but that could change.
Okay.
And all of the books are available in Kindle, ebook, paperback. The first 2, A Corpse in the Soup and Terror in a Teapot, are available in audio from Books in Motion. The Vanishing Act in Vegas is going to be released, I think, by the end of this year in audio by Books in Motion, and they will be starting the production on Diamonds in the Dumpster.
And also the first one, the first audio book, Corpse in the Soup, won the USA Book News Best Audio Mystery of the Year in 2007 when we published it.
Okay.
Right.
So
I mean,
we had
we've
a great narrator, by the way.
Yeah, we've had a great time coming up with the plots and the personalities. And the cool thing is, by having the characters have some of our own aspects, Phyllis knows how Goldie's mind works, and I know how Godiva's mind works. And, maybe Phyllis would come up with the thing of, in one of the books, she said, she gave her $100 tip. I said, not Godiva. She may be rich, but that's why she's rich.
Well,
Right.
one thing I'd like to say too is your book covers for each one of these books is so intriguing that they look like they are so much fun that you really want to get jumping right into them.
Thank you, Jan. We designed those ourselves.
Really,
Right.
they're fabulous.
Yeah, we used to be with traditional publishers.
I was going to ask you that. What happened with that?
and that publisher, in fact, the audio book that you have on display, that has the cover that the traditional publisher had. And they had a tragedy in that company. They had 200 authors, and one of the partners contracted cancer, and within a couple of months she was gone. And they had been best friends from the time they were young. And the other partner was so devastated she couldn't carry the company on, and she gave all of the authors back the rights to their books.
Which was nice.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so then we had the decision to make. Do we want to try to get a different publisher? And at that time, self-publishing was really becoming very, very good.
Yeah.
And I had a friend who publishes a noir mystery series, and he said, you need to go into self-publishing. You have the following, you have the control over what you're doing. And he kept hammering at me, and finally I said to Phyllis, you know what, let's self-publish this.
Yep.
Phyllis being a graphics designer, my having some art background, we were able to come up with the concepts for our covers and the interiors of our books, and we've loved self-publishing.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
Morgan does all the detail work. And Morgan is, Morgan's the workhorse. You know, a lot of people ask us, and you're probably going to ask us, how do we do this?
Yeah.
How do we work
Right.
together? Well, Morgan is type A. You know, give her a project and she just grabs onto it like
Right.
a bulldog,
Yes,
and
we know.
and it gets done. I'm more type B. Although my friends will tell you they think I'm type A, but they haven't met Morgan. So, you know, I'm the type that, you know, give me a project and I'll put it in the corner of my desk and I'll say, well, I'll get to this next week. But I am the consummate editor. And if you put something in front of me that needs editing, I can't stand it. I have to do it right away. So,
Which I know well.
right. So what we do is we plot it out. I'm losing this. We plot it out ahead of time. And, thank you. And,
The winter headset.
you know, we get together and we do the brainstorming session and we get our plot worked out and we know what's sort of going to go in each chapter. And then Morgan just grabs that, and she's the type of writer that can just automatically, you know, start writing. But, you know, it's rough. And so she'll send the rough thing to me, and I'll read it and oh no, I gotta work on this right away. I push everything aside, you know, I gotta clean this up. And I'll add a lot of the humor and the situations and things like that. And then I'll send it back to her. And she'll read my edited version and she'll make her corrections and send it back to me. And so we do that a couple of times until we're satisfied. And then at the end of the process, we actually have these marathon telephone calls.
3-4 hours at a clip.
Yeah,
One
wow.
of us
my
will
gosh.
read the whole chapter while the other one is taking notes about what doesn't sound right. Because it could look right on paper, but when you're going to do an audio as well, you have to know that that sounds right.
Yes.
And so the one that's listening will put down all the little notes, and then we'll discuss it after the chapter is read, and then we'll put in those corrections, we'll make those changes, and then the other one reads it out loud so that the other one can listen to it and see if it sounds right. And we'll do that throughout the entire book. It takes hours and hours and hours, but it really works well.
Well, you've already showed the two different personalities. You've already unplugged your mic. You've lost your headset.
Yeah.
we are in competition, James, to be the queen of the pluses.
Phyllis is a rebel all on her own.
I know. I'm the rebel.
I am a rebel, and I am the aging hippie, and I'm still, you know, or I would call myself a hippie elder.
Oh. I have a feeling you and I are the same age.
We may well be.
Oh, okay. Well, so you've kind of covered a little bit of this. We were going to talk about who comes up with the concept, and we didn't say exactly. Like when you guys came up with, you collaborated last night,
Right.
came up with an idea. Who started that process, and how did it begin?
That one I started.
Yeah,
Okay.
Phyllis said, I'm here for 6 days or 7 days, whatever it's going to be. And part of my objective is that we get the plotting done for the next book. So we sat at my kitchen table, and we both brought our laptops there, facing each other. And, you know, we started out with a intro that Phyllis had written, and we both had it on our laptops. And then we started brainstorming from there. Okay, what happens here? What happens there? What do you think about this? We need this character. Let's not have all our characters be white bread. You know, let's introduce some ethnicities.
Yeah.
And, you know, we kind of went through the whole thing until we had up to a certain point. And then tonight we'll probably pick it up from there and go to the next point. And the way we work, we don't do actual outlines, but we come up with plot points and things that we want that move the story forward while it's developing the plot. And the beauty of that, I mean, we came up with this after I don't know how many different things we've tried.
Different ways
to
of doing
do
it.
the plotting. We even had some very elaborate sheets that we used to plug things in on.
Was there any wine involved in any of this?
I don't drink.
Oh.
Phyllis doesn't drink.
Oh, okay.
She doesn't know what's going on my end.
I don't know what she's,
What's in that
maybe
glass?
this is why she's so type A. I don't know. But
Yeah. Why did you slur that?
well, one of the things that Morgan didn't mention about this process is that we use the old adage, write what you know. And we, first of all, we come from a very zany family.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Everybody dancing and singing and making music and laughing and joking. So we already have the background for the humor.
Okay.
We have taken people out of our family and jiggered them around a little bit, and they become our characters.
Okay.
We have the process or the plot happen in places that we've lived
Or
So-
have visited.
or have visited, so we know something about that place. So one of the first book takes place mostly in L.A., but some of it a little bit in Juneau. The second book takes place mostly in Juneau and then some of it in L.A. The third book takes place in Vegas. And the fourth book takes place mostly on a cruise ship between Los Angeles and Juneau. And the next one, since I now live in Oregon, is going to take place in Portland.
Okay.
So we're kind of, using our own geographic knowledge as
Right.
well as the knowledge of our crazy family.
Yeah.
We've given them all really quirky names, and that helps us move the plot along because we know, where we are and who we're featuring.
Yeah.
And Phyllis and I also have spent a reasonable amount of time in Seattle. So in the second book, it goes from Juneau to Seattle to Los Angeles.
Right.
And we're sure that the locations feel authentic, that the character of the people, because the people in each location are different due to their demographics. And so, like if we're writing a Juneau scene, Phyllis is the one that fills in the character of Juneau,
Right,
some of the real characters,
Quirkiness.
Right, the
that live in
nuances, yeah.
Juneau.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, so it's not
You
something...
mean like the Chicken Ridge kazoo and kitchen
Oh,
utensil
yes.
band?
She has that in one of them where Goldie is playing what's she playing, the washboard? Or
Yeah,
the-
well, I think she's playing the kazoo, but then somebody else plays the spoons.
Yeah,
and someone else.
and I
plays
said to Phyllis, how did you ever come up with a crazy name like that for a band? She said, because I was a member of it.
the Chicken Ridge Rowdies. Kitchen
Right, what you know.
Chicken
Yeah.
utensils and kazoos.
But one other interesting point is when we first wrote the book, and we were going through the routine of querying the agents and everything else, and with the quirky names that we used, like in A Corpse in the Soup, the 4 competing chefs in the Gourmet Gladiators tournament are Caesar Romano, the romantic chef, Toulouse Jankowski, the Polish Cajun, Moishi Matsumoto, the king of kosher sushi,
And Biff Wellington.
who exercises with chicken legs. And so, some of the comments that we got back from agents is, that is too far over the top. I mean, who would go for names like that? Do you know what we get the most comments on? People love the quirky names.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You guys talked about this a little bit, but I'm sure there has to be something there. Has there ever been a difficult time when you guys were working together and you couldn't agree on something?
Yeah. There
Okay.
have been a few times.
It
I mean,
happens.
So
yeah.
did you just not talk and then come back together a couple
no,
days later?
we wind up working it out because, like Phyllis said, that's the agreement that we had in the beginning. And
it was. I'm sorry to
Go ahead.
interrupt you, but the most important revelation that we had in working these things out was to say there will be no personal insults.
Right.
Oh, okay. All right.
So we work strictly on the reason I'm fighting for this is because of this is why I think it's best. And we started out at the very beginning sort of insulting each other.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
I mean, like, oh, that's just stupid, you know? How could you
Right.
think that? And then we realized that, no, that we will never be able to write compatibly unless we say there will be no personal insults.
So you
Right.
worked that out in a long
Very
time
Early
ago.
on,
Very-
very
very
early
beginning.
on.
Yeah.
But I want you ladies to know this. I have that same argument with myself, and I'm not collaborating with anybody but me. And I'll read something, and I'll say, "What were you thinking? That makes no sense."
Yeah,
That
what
doesn't
happened
even
when
go
you
to the
answered
story."
yourself?
So
She lost.
I got a really good editor who fixed me.
All right. And so we've talked about you disagree with things you have. Okay. Who develops the publishing and marketing? That's kind of interesting because since you no longer have a traditional publisher and you've taken that over,
Right.
who's really in charge of all that?
I do that whole thing.
Okay.
I
Type
taught,
A.
I taught myself how to format the interiors, so I don't have to use an interior formatter. We used to use a professional to do the digital, but now there are some platforms that
Oh, yeah.
I've found that make it great to just do, and you can get the Mobi and the EPUB
Right.
files.
Like draft to digital. That's
Draft
one.
to digital, that's who I use.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they, that's a much more user-friendly and better-looking platform than using the KDP Kindle one.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you can grab that Mobi and you can grab that EPUB file and then upload them to the different digital sites like Smashwords and Kindle, and they're a better-looking book
Yeah.
than you would get with Kindle.
Right. Well, and Morgan does all of that. And I would emphasize that since we began writing, and that's pretty much when Morgan began seriously writing.
Yeah.
The writing has been the thing that is Morgan now. Whereas I've always been the artist.
Okay.
And I've always written things, poetry and whatnot, and various things for copywriting and stuff. But art is really my field. And, I'm a professional artist, and I own part of this gallery and so forth. And so for me, the reason I write is really to do something nice with my sister. I
So
mean, that's why I do this.
And you have no problem turning that over to her then.
No
That
problem
frees up your time to
whatsoever.
do
She's
other
very
things.
happy to do
Yeah. if it was up to me, it probably wouldn't get done.
Yeah, but I shepherd it all the way through the publishing, and also I've made the contacts with Books in Motion and done the negotiation with them for the audio rights and all of that. But I seem to go in cycles, with all the various things I've done in my life. The two main ones were I was an interior designer for about 20 years, an active functioning interior designer, and now I've been writing for about 20 years. So it seems like I do all these other things until I find something I'm passionate about.
Yeah.
And then I stick with that. And I think writing's going to be the last one, or I'll be 110 years old.
Well, you never know.
And we have paralleled because even though, like, I've done a whole bunch of different things too, but at a certain point, I was an interior designer.
Right.
Well, I was a historic restorationist.
Okay.
So I did the historic restoration of buildings in Juneau, which is a little different than interior design because you're
Preserving.
you're preserving
Yeah.
and you're
Yeah.
trying to bring back the historical look of something, whereas with interior design you might be doing just the opposite. You might be sort of covering up the old with something fresh and new.
You should have done a picture book about that.
Well, there is actually a picture book about the governor's mansion in Alaska, and I am featured in it.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah. All right. Question. This is not to start an argument. Whose name goes first on the book?
Morgan,
Because
the hardest worker.
oh, that's nice that you say that. That's great. And what advice could you give someone working on a collaborative piece? And we have done a show on this, so we're going to talk about this in a minute because
Yeah.
there are other ways of doing this as well.
Right. Well, you know that I've worked not only with my sister, but with other authors collaborating
Right.
on work.
Like 4 books, I think, right?
Oh, well, let's see. I've done 3 books with Denny Griffin, and the
The
No
incest
More Crying Angels
Okay,
with Bella Capo,
Oh, yeah.
and The Incest Murder and a Miracle with Robin Cheryl Cuccio, and Rip Off with Carolyn Rao. So I've worked with different authors, and it's always a different dynamic. It depends on, number one, where their strengths are, if they're a self-starter or if they're somebody who needs to be prodded along, what the quality of their writing is, and who has a strength where. But as far as I lost my
Well, you know, we were
place.
talking about you work with other authors, and
Yes.
one of the things I wanted to ask you is what's different in working with the other authors as opposed to working with your sister?
I don't have the personal connection with them. Number one, well, I mean, I have a connection, but not a sibling connection.
Right.
And
Because you
the
know
oth-
Phyllis more.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. And the other thing is, which I hadn't even thought about until you asked the question, James, is Phyllis and I grew up together. I've known Phyllis since she was an infant.
Yeah.
So I know the stages she's gone through, and with us using Goldie as her character, I've known the stages she's gone through. I've seen the various development phases. I know her personality inside out, maybe more inside than out. Maybe more outside than in. I don't know. But I mean, it's a different sort of connection. And while I've become good friends with the other people I've collaborated with, Phyllis is my best friend.
Yeah, yeah.
And I would say that Morgan can give all the advice on working with other authors because I've only worked with Morgan. But I would say for anyone who's working with someone else, take your ego, unzip it, hang it up in the closet,
Yeah.
and put it away.
Absolutely.
Do not get personally insulted if the other author doesn't like what you wrote or has another idea or something like that. It's absolutely critical to separate yourself from your work.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the one other thing, I'm sorry for interrupting, James, is right in the beginning, figure out who has which strength, because you're going to play to the strength that that particular collaborator has. They will carry that ball and you'll carry the other ball. And also, as Phyllis said with our working together, decide how you settle disagreements.
Yeah, that would be very.
And I've collaborated as well. My name is not on the books, but I have collaborated
Yeah.
with others to help them write their books. And sometimes I found it to be a little difficult. In your case, a lot of these people aren't here in Vegas where
Right.
you live, so you've had to communicate
None of
with
them are.
Right. The people that I've collaborated with, except one, lived here. So we would meet and talk. And I don't know sometimes that might be a disadvantage. And the reason for that is that it opens it up for a debate.
Yes.
And sometimes there can't be a debate. And I remember I had one book, actually the first book I ever helped someone with. I had to help translate from one language into another. And in their language, they would read from the back forward. And I had the most difficult time trying to get this person to understand that in English you have to read from the front
Right.
forward. So instead of saying we came from up the hill and then we were at the well, you have to say we went to the well, we washed our hands, we walked down into the valley and up the other side. In other words, you have to redirect the way
Right.
you're reading this.
Right.
Right.
And it took, I don't know, probably at least 2 chapters for this person to understand why I was telling him, no, you have to start the story from the beginning to the
Right.
end,
Well, and I have another little piece of advice, even though I haven't collaborated with other people than Morgan. When I was a copywriter and I'd write, the text of a annual report or anything like that, I had to write something that was approved by the other person that I was writing for. And I learned a few lessons in that. And one of them was that when people look at a typewritten page, they read it differently than when they look at it in typeset form, in book form. And you give them a draft, and they'll read it, and they'll go, yeah, that looks fine. And then you'll give them the final product, and they'll be like, I didn't know this was in here. You can't write this. And it was like, well, it was in there, but you missed it. So you have to remember that there is a difference between the perception of writing on the printed page and the draft copy. But the one thing that I really learned was that almost everyone wants to have some useful input into something you've written for them.
Yes.
And so what I used to do, that's tell my little secret, I used to purposely put in a few errors. And I would let the person find those errors. And I go, oh, gee, I missed that. I'm so glad you looked this over because I would have missed that. Mm-hmm. And then they felt like they had given some
Right.
useful
Very
input.
good psychology.
Yeah.
And if they didn't find it, I knew where the error was. I fixed it, you know.
Yeah.
But it was critical that they had some hand in feeling like they've had some useful input.
That's very good.
Yeah.
You know, another thing, just kind of backtracking to the self-publishing and the proofing and all of that, it's critical to get printed proofs if you're self-publishing.
Yeah.
Because right to Phyllis's thing that you see different things in a typewritten draft than you see in the published.
Exactly. Yeah.
Every single book that I've done where I think it's perfect, right? And I send it off to Create Space and I get my printed proof back. And after the first experience with that, I automatically get a couple of pads of stickies and a pen because I know I'm probably going to use up that entire pad of stickies.
I agree with you on this. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, and we had two authors on who collaborated long distance and had never met. I think you know about them,
Right.
Yeah,
7 years.
Chris Keaton and Rick
Table.
Yeah, well, you know, I never met Bella Capo until the book was finished, and I never met Rob and Cheryl Cuccio until we were about 2/3 of the way through the book.
Yeah. And they didn't even talk on the phone, from what I understand. They did everything by messenger and
Okay.
email.
Yeah.
And then when they were finally putting the whole project together and were about to send it off to get published, that's when they made contact. So that is interesting. If you think about it, that eliminates a lot of things because you can't argue if you're not talking.
true.
Well, although sometimes the argument makes it better.
Yeah,
So
that's true too.
You know, I would say that in what you're saying, if you don't know the person and you're working long distance, you might have some real feelings about how to improve something, but you don't know that person well enough to correct them.
Yeah.
And maybe that correction would have been a real plus.
Well, the good thing is I think Rick was a kind of author that he didn't hold back.
Okay.
And Chris was the kind of author who was open to suggestion. So that probably worked out well because of their personalities.
Yeah, it could-
and then Chris also, it came from a script. He actually wrote the script first. So Rick had to take the script and basically help create the novel from the script. So it was a little bit different dynamics.
Backwards,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it could have really blown up.
Oh, it could have, yeah.
If the one who was very open to criticism was somebody who was very possessive of what he did.
Yeah.
Now, the thing that surprised me about that is the length of time that these two gentlemen worked together before ever meeting, and that was 7 years on this
Wow,
project.
that's a long
I know,
time,
it is
yeah.
a long time. Yeah. And then I worked with someone who, she was from another country, but English was her degree in that country. But even with that degree, things read a little differently, or you say things a little differently. And we had a few disputes on figuring out how we wanted to word things. I don't know necessarily that one or the other won, but we finally did come to an agreement on what needed to be done. And then I had one that I worked with in Arkansas, and my problem with that person is trying to elaborate on the story, trying to convince this person that the story you have written doesn't work. You really need to tell why did this happen, what led up to this,
Right.
what was your family like before you had children, what was your background, what was your husband's background, because it was a story about them and their children. And it really was relevant to what was going on. You really needed to know that information in order to comprehend what their thinking was.
Yeah, well, you know, Denny Griffin and I had an experience like that. There's a book that we co-authored that I won't mention the name of it because we wound up taking our names off of as co-authors and said you could use us as a consultant. You know, list us as a consultant. But that was a very difficult book to write and to co-author because the person whose story we were telling, it was a true story, And, we would send this whole list of prompts and get back 1 and 2 word answers. And then we'd have to go, no, you need to elaborate on this. You need to tell about this. And one point was, it was a dramatic story, and all she could remember of her childhood were the bad times. And we said, well, no, there had to
Right.
be
Had to
some
be
good
good.
times.
Right.
Yes.
We have to balance this.
Right.
Yeah.
And she said, no, there were no good balance. And we said, you really need to go back into your memories and
Yeah.
try to pull out the good times so we can balance it.
Right.
And when she was all done with it, she said, my God, I'd forgotten about all those things. I'd shoved them out of the way.
That's
It
typical.
wasn't all bad.
Yeah, typical in life is to always remember the bad things,
Yeah.
and yeah, that's what we dwell on. Now with Denny, does Denny live here in Las Vegas, or does he live in LA?
He used to live in Las
Yeah.
Vegas. Now he spends his time between New York, upstate New York, and Florida. And,
because when
we're
you
s-
collaborated with him, though, most of the time he was here.
well, yes and no.
Yeah.
Because he, on the first book, he was here all the time, on No More Crying Angels. But then when we collaborated on another book, Bumping Off Fat Vinny, which was
yeah.
fiction, and it's part of the Revenge is Fun series. He had already moved to New York, sold the house here, and moved to New York. And so we did all of it the same way Phyllis and I were doing it, by emails and long telephone
Yeah,
conversations.
what I was getting at though is it probably made it more comfortable for you because you knew Denny.
Oh, absolutely.
You really got to know him as a
Absolutely.
friend.
Absolutely.
And especially when you did the
Yes.
collaboration with the other authors
Yes,
that you
yes.
both worked together
Oh,
on.
absolutely, absolutely. Because we had a friendship level as well as being co-authors,
Yeah.
and we had no problems discussing where the challenges were and how we had to move things from one point to another.
So there was never any debates or anything.
Not between us.
Yeah.
And we also, on that particular book, we were also very fortunate to have one of the members of Henderson Writers Group acting as our editor during the entire writing process.
Okay.
And, that was terrific. Dara, why am I zoning on Dara's last name? I know it like the back of my hand. But Dara gave us great input, and he sort of acted as a buffer.
Okay. Oh, that's kind of neat. Okay.
That makes me recall something that we haven't discussed here.
What's that?
Is that when we first started writing together, we really didn't know how to write fiction.
True.
Okay.
And our first attempt at A Corpse in the Soup was really dreadful.
Really?
We
Yeah.
had the plot, and we had the characters, and that was all okay. But our writing was all wrong. We
They
didn't
were
know about point of view.
Right.
We didn't know about,
Character development.
all these different things that make a good book. And the first shot at it, we got a bunch of rejections.
Yeah, a lot of them.
And we
Well, how did you
actually-
figure out you had done it
well,
wrong?
We actually went to a writing consultant, and she helped us. She went through the book and said, "Okay, well, this doesn't work. You're going to have to do something about that." And we rewrote the book.
Right,
We
and
rewrote the whole book
She
based
didn't
on
do
that.
she didn't do the rewrites. She gave us the suggestions and had us do everything.
Right.
And it was like taking a class in fiction. We
Yeah.
worked with Jen
Yeah.
for a year.
Right.
And the very interesting point on this, it happened because one of the agents was kind enough to give us a handwritten evaluation. And she said, I can tell that you're both seasoned writers. I can tell that you're very polished, but you know absolutely nothing about writing fiction.
Yeah.
And she said, my suggestion is not an editor, but you need to find a manuscript evaluator. And once you go through your manuscript with a manuscript evaluator, you will have something that's publishable.
Yeah, she
And
liked
so-
the book, but she said,
Yeah. And so we found Jen online, and we worked with her for a year. We never had a telephone conversation with her. It was always by email. And at the end of the book, when we finally were finished, we paid her the final installment. And we found out why we never had a telephone conversation with her. She was deaf.
Oh, wow.
yeah, yeah.
Wow.
And she lived in, I don't know, New Hampshire or something like
somewhere
that.
on the other side of the country. But we clicked with her so well and never suspected that if we had wanted a telephone conversation, she couldn't hear us.
Right. But that
Wow.
that was a real revelation for us, and that's something that new writers, whether they're collaborating or not, should recognize that if they're getting, now grant you, almost every writer gets rejections, and
Right.
sometimes lots of them.
Right.
But if they're getting rejections and somewhere along the way, one of those rejectors gives them a handwritten note that says, here's what you need to improve.
Right.
They should really take that to heart and think about having a consultant. Now, we had some instances where Jen had given us advice and we looked at it and we said, no, not going to do that.
Yeah, because
that-
she was a romance writer.
Yeah, she was a romance writer, and there were some things that she had in there that we just looked at it and said, not good advice. We're not going to do
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, his
And that-
burgeoning muscles
But
didn't
that's like
work.
any editor doing anything to your book. You know, you're not expected to go along with exactly everything they say.
Right,
You know?
right. But this was even more in depth. This was not only did she find the places in the book, but she explained to us how to do the various things. She made us aware of point of view and how to work with it. And, you know, that was invaluable. And when we first got the critique from this agent, we both got very belligerent. And we said,
Oh.
what does she mean that we don't know about point of view?
But she didn't
I
hear
mean-
you anyway.
She what?
You didn't talk to her though.
No,
so-
no.
okay.
Between us,
Oh, okay,
we were
okay,
saying,
okay, all right.
what does she mean we don't know about point of view? Of course this one said this one. Of course that one said that one. And we didn't realize that we were head hopping and we were having things that the person whose point of view it was couldn't possibly know those things.
Yeah.
And we had to learn how to work with it.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is now I give workshops on point of view.
But you know, isn't that great though
Yeah.
that you went from not really
Right.
knowing how to format to now you're actually teaching people how to do
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah, we always said that it was like that. It was well worth the money we paid because it was like having a private college course on how to construct fiction.
I forgot who I had on the show, but someone was telling me, oh, when we did the events at Alexis Park, we had one of the, I think it was Maureen, where she took a class on something and she thought, this is great. I need to incorporate this into what I do or find a way. And he encouraged them, go out there and teach what I just taught you.
Yes.
You know, like use this. I don't care if you make money
Yeah.
from it. Just take what I taught you and use it.
Oh, and,
So
and the other thing that we learned, not from Jen, but from one of the workshops that you went to, was machete editing.
Oh yes! Oh my God!
And you have to, when you're a writer, you have to be willing to kill your babies. You know,
maybe that's what Truman Capote meant from the quote I did.
maybe that was it. But I mean, there were when we did the first run of machete editing, I was adamant, you can't take that out. No, that's my favorite part.
Yeah.
And Morgan was ruthless. You know, she said, no, I learned that you can't put all this stuff in, and you can't be, you know, loyal to something that isn't good. You know, you've got to let it go. And once we learned that lesson, it really improved the work immensely.
Phyllis was really resistant to it, and the workshop was at one of the very first Henderson Writer Group sponsored Las Vegas Writers Conferences, and it was the only writers conference I had ever attended at that point. And I, as I remember, the people presenting it were from Indiana or something like that. And I walked out of that conference going, this was worth the entire conference to take that one
Wow.
workshop.
Yeah.
And as Phyllis kept resisting, finally I said, well, I'm not going to get anywhere with her. So what I'm going to have to do is take 2 chapters, do a chopping machete edit, and send them to her and tell her to keep an open mind and let me know if she misses any of the things that were cut out, that she couldn't compare it to the other one.
Yeah.
And I sent you a couple of chapters,
right.
and I said, just read them through, and what I want to know is if you can tell what was taken out and if you miss any of it. And she got back to me and she said, machete edit.
Yeah, there were a few things that I really liked, and I'd say, well, but I really liked that part, but it's not necessary.
Right.
Yeah.
But
right.
Well-
the first thing she said when she told me about this kind of editing was, "You're not going to like this," and she was right.
What's the one piece of advice you would give to someone collaborating?
No blood on the floor.
I think I've already said it too, which
Okay.
is just
Yeah.
put your ego aside,
Yeah.
and decide what's best for the book, not what's best to soothe your ego.
Exactly.
Right. And I'd add one more thing that we hadn't discussed. And once again, see, you always stimulate me to think about things.
Well, you have 2 minutes.
Okay, I won't even need 2 minutes. Is that if you have certain feelings about something, don't hold it inside and stew. Be willing to talk about it with
Yeah.
your collaborator.
Oh, yeah, that's good.
Morgan, you did something in less than 2 minutes? I'm amazed. My mother always said she was vaccinated with the Victrola needle.
Well, we're down to the last minute of the show, and so I would like to thank our guests, Morgan St. James and Phyllice Bradner, and I would like for you to tell us where we can find your work.
The best place to look for it is at any online bookseller. Every single one of them should have our
Okay.
books. And also there's a Silver Sisters blog website, and it's silversistersmysteries.blogspot.com. And you'll always find information, links, and all kinds of things like that.
All right. Well, Morgan, thank you so much. Phyllis, thank you. And Janet Corsi, she also has The Secrets of Time out there, which can be found on
Amazon and Barnes & Nobles and here, there, and everywhere. Go to my website, janetcorsi.com,
Okay.
and there you are.
All right. And to learn more about Aspects of Writing, just go to aspectsofwriting.com, and there you'll find the video of this show and our past shows. You can get a link there to go to YouTube. And also, we're on Roku TV. We also have our archive shows on Aspects of Writing. Just go to click on Aspects of Writing and then click on the Archive tab, and they'll have all of our past shows on there. And you can also get the links to iHeartRadio, iTunes, AMFM247.com. There's 14 terrestrial stations, so you can learn where to listen to us live when it's out there. And I'm proud to announce we're also on Blog Talk Radio now. We have a link for that as well. And if you have anyone have any questions real quick before we go off air?
I just want to say thank you for having
you're
me back
welcome.
again and welcoming Phyllis and showing her that Las Vegas isn't
I
all
know.
glitz and glamour.
I think of Las Vegas as looking like a big kitty litter box.
Well, this is your host, James Kelly, reminding you, if you can dream it, you can write it. Thank you, everyone.
Okay.
Geez, that was wonderful.